lunch. Well, Arrowhead Properties reported full-year total annualized distribution of 100.58 cents per unit, 2.2% higher than the initial annualized forecast. The company's asset base increased by 50%, and Imraan Suleman, who's CFO of Arrowhead Properties, joins us now for more detail on these numbers. Thanks so much, Imraan, for joining us this afternoon. Well, let's get straight into it. I mean, when it comes to the company and its exposure in terms of the portfolio of properties you're exposed to, run us through that.
Arrowhead has at present 107 properties. We've got exposure across all 9 provinces in South Africa. We've got exposure across the commercial, retail and industrial sectors, roughly split amongst 43% commercial, 38% retail and 19% industrial.
Taking a look at
Imraan, this is very interesting that you say that you have got that portfolio you've just described in secondary locations throughout South Africa. So you've got a geographical spread and also a spread between retail, industrial and commercial. The secondary locations, was that a deliberate ploy of yours because the so-called primary locations were at a premium and were already well served by other companies, and you're hoping that perhaps that the secondary locations, as the economy grows and the middle class grows, become primary locations?
Yes, I think primarily the primary locations are all being sought after by every player in the listed property sector. We've identified a niche. The space that we're playing in, there isn't that much competition for properties, and we're actually finding quite a bit of properties or potential properties for us to acquire and grow the portfolio in these secondary locations. We think they're very defensible. The secondary locations have proven to be very resilient. And we think we're going to see growth coming out of these regions.
Where competition is scarce within that space, I mean, what does that imply for your rentals and what you're able to charge?
Let me go back a bit when I say competition is scarce in that space. I think every listed property fund wants to be in those areas, but the types of properties that we're looking at, the other guys wouldn't look at. We would, for example, never look at a property, a retail centre in Sandton, for example. We've bought something out in the Eastern Cape, in Solo and in Sterkspruit. The properties are typically smaller than what the other major players in the property industry typically look after. But having said that, they tenanted largely by national tenants. I mean, we've had over 75% exposure to national tenants in these centres that we've bought.
Imraan, is there an identifiable difference between the way that a so-called secondary property portfolio behaves to a primary portfolio when it comes to, say, for example, if there's a downturn in South Africa, a continued downturn in 2013, would the more primary locations, the primary properties, behave better than the secondary, or the other way around?
I don't think so. I think from the secondary, for example, if I go back to these 2 properties that we've bought in the Eastern Cape, to get to them I had to drive probably 2 hours from Bloemfontein to get to Sterkspruit when I went out to have a look at the actual property. I mean, I drove through literally a catchment area of 45 kilometers that this rural development actually services. People get into their taxis and they go out to these areas to do their shopping. I went through on a Tuesday afternoon. It was really very busy, much busier than most of the shopping centres on a weekday in the primary areas are. And there's actually demand for space. What you find,
I was just going to ask you what kind of demand you're actually catering to, and specifically, what do you make of the stability of that demand?
We're very pleased with what we've seen. I mean, in the centres that we've got in these rural areas, there's virtually no vacancy. A lease comes up for expiry. If in the event that the tenant leaves, we've got 3 or 4 people waiting 3 or 4 potential tenants waiting to take over that space. We think it's actually very defensible, and it's actually primed for growth.
Imraan, what's next? Are you going to continue with an adding policy, in other words, an acquisition policy? You're going to bed this down? You seem to have gone very fast in a very short space of time. Consolidation, or continue on the trail of snapping up properties that other people might sort of dismiss as not worth looking at?
I think we're definitely going to continue in the vein that we have in the last year. We actually want to grow the portfolio by another 30% in the year to come. We've actually, a year ago, set ourselves a target of also 30%. We've actually achieved 50% growth in the property portfolio. And again, the key focus from Arrowhead's perspective is on distributable income. A year ago, we promised unit holders that we would pay them a distribution of 98.36 cents. We've actually paid 100.58 cents. In the announcement that we put out today, we've actually put out a forecast of 111 cents, and that's actually going to be the focus of Arrowhead going forward for the next year.
What's your outlook for the property space in South Africa as we move into next year?
I think it's in a tough environment, but very defensible. I think property has proven to be resilient. Property has performed very well over the last few years, and I think we're actually going to see that going forward.